Me and Frank were always very close to each other. He was my youngest brother, and I loved him dearly. When we grew up, he married my best friend Jane. I lived in Southline, Michigan at the time. I had a visit from Frank. He and Jane plus their 4 boys all lived in Portland, Oregon. It was the early morning, November 10th, 1992. Around 6 a.m., I was suddenly awakened by a tap on the shoulder. I looked up, and there stood Frank, my brother. He backed up a little and I got a better look at him. "How did you get there, Frank?" I asked, but he just stared at me and said, "Tell Jane I love her." I looked closely at Frank and noticed he had shaven his beard off, something he had never done before. His appearance was very clean, which seemed odd, for he had a drinking problem and would get drunk often. He wore a red plaided shirt and blue jeans. His front tooth was no longer missing, so I thought he had also had his teeth done. But when he told me, "Tell Jane he loved her," I replied back, "Why don't you? What's going on, Frank?" I continued to ask. He said nothing back, but started towards the kitchen. I told him as he was walking away, "You might as well put on a pot of coffee, and I'll get dressed." Just then I heard the front door shut, and he was gone. It made me a little angry, and I thought since my older brother Mike was renting the house next door, Frank might have went there. I called over at Mike's and told Frank was in town. To my surprise, Mike said he never seen him, but he had to go to work and couldn't talk right now. So I tried to get into my regular chores of housework, when suddenly as I went back into my bedroom, a cold chill went right through my soul. Something I can't even explain, but it made me go to the phone and I called Jane in Portland, Oregon. I thought I dialed the wrong number, for a woman's voice answered the phone. I said, "Is this Frank's house?" She replied, "Just a moment. I'll get Jane on the phone." When Jane got on, she said in a very low voice, "Joyce?" I answered back, "Hey Jane, how did Frank get here in Michigan?" She was so surprised, because I never call long distance, but I almost fainted when she replied, "He couldn't have been there, Joyce." I have some terrible news. Last night or early this morning, I found Frank. He had offed himself late last night or early this morning. "What do you mean you've seen Frank this morning?" I told her the details, and she had told me that last night Frank had shaven his beard off, took some sad country music titled "In the Real World," went out into the barn, and the rest, as you know, is history. She thought he was just going on one of his drunks and feeling sorry for himself. He had never mentioned offing himself to her. In the early dawn, she could hear the music, for it was blasting, and you could hear it all out there in the barn. As she tried to open the door, it would hardly budge. She yelled for Frank to open it, but when he would not, she pushed it open, to find she had already pushed his body as it was swinging near the door, with his eyes gazing at her. She ran for the house, but told me it was like running through mud. In her mind, this had to be a nightmare. Later on, she told me Frank was wearing a red plaided shirt and blue jeans. I gave her his message, "Tell Jane I love her." My older brother Mike believes me, for I had already told him. Frank had visited me this morning. Also, Jane was very religious, and they, her close friends, were saying a prayer for Jane to get the courage to call the family. When I called, I interrupted the prayer. It was already answered. Then I had to give the horrible news to my parents and other brothers and sisters. Jane was also on the Good Morning America for people helping others through times as these. I remember that we had a memorial service for Frank of our own in here in Michigan. I was sleeping. My husband, who was awake, noticed a lovely hawk standing on a branch of our pine tree, only 5 feet from the window. My husband, knowing how Frank loved hawks and kept a lot of them on his place, thought he should wake me up. Before the hawk flew away, I got up to see what was the big deal, and with the coffee in one hand, I watched Frank's favorite bird. He folded his wings and wouldn't move around for 30 minutes. Then, as waking up, off he flew. We never see hawks this close to the house. I knew in my heart this was God's way of letting me know Hank is as free as his friends the Hawk were. That very same day in Oregon, Shane also released Frank's Hawks, except they didn't want to leave, and it took a few days. Then slowly they left. I left South Lyon since then, but I've had a lot of experience with ghosts and spirits ever since I was very young, but that's another story. This is a true story. What I'm about to tell you occurred during the summer of 1980. My wife and I had bought a mobile home and had it placed in a very nice park in southeast Fort Worth, Texas. We had one daughter aged 3. Everything went fine until early one morning around 3 a.m. Gary. I was suddenly awakened by a woman's voice calling my name. I sat up and listened to the stillness. I must have imagined it, I thought. The stillness was broken by the eerie sounding voice again. This time I was wide awake. By then my wife was wide awake too. She grabbed my right arm. "That's your mother calling you," she said in a very shaky voice. "That just can't be. You know she died 3 years ago." "Gary," the voice called out again, causing the hair on the back of my neck to stand up. Maybe I should have asked who it was, or what it wanted, but I thought someone was in my trailer uninvited. The voice coming from next to our daughter's room down the hall. I jumped up in my underwear and ran from our bedroom into the hall. Turning on the light as I did, Lisa was sitting up in bed, pointing at a picture of my mother in the hall. As I carried Lisa to our room, I thought I could smell my mother's perfume in the hall. I asked my daughter why she was pointing at Mama's picture, and she said, "Mama's here, in my room, Daddy." Later that night, we could hear her calling my name, scaring us badly. I checked the place out, so I knew it was secure. The next morning, I went out to get the paper, and as I came back towards the trailer, I saw that our daughter's screen was bent and lying on the ground. I saw where someone had pried it off. I called the police, and they said something must have scared him off, because a locked window would have not stopped this pervert. He had hurt other young girls. He was shot later on around daybreak, just down the street. He must have been trying to get into Lisa's room around the time my mother woke us up. She had told me on her deathbed that she would always watch out for my family. Thanks, Mom. I guess I should start by stating that my family is weird, or lack of a better word. I'm a believer in extreme and ghosts and such. The family joke is that 6 generations of clairvoyance can't be wrong. My first experiences began in my grandparents' house. I guess I was about 3 or 4 when I first encountered Bill. The circumstances surrounding his arrival and timing are quite sketchy. This was the summer of 1977. My grandfather was in the hospital after suffering a heart attack. My mother was on the phone and looked out into the hallway and saw a figure of a man standing there, looking at her like, "Get off the phone." My mother quickly hung up with her friend and called the hospital, fearing the worst, that it was her father standing in the hallway looking at her. Mom called and talked to my grandma and grandpa. Everything was as fine as could be. But who was the guy in the hallway? Mom didn't realize that she was not the only one who could see Bill. My sister and I could see him walk through the hallway, walk through the kitchen, hear him walking up down the stairs, open doors, and all sorts of nonsense. One night I was in the bedroom watching TV with my grandpa and heard my grandma call for him. Bill, my grandfather as well as our vaporous house guest's name. "What did you go into the kitchen for?" "I wasn't in the kitchen. I'm in here with Joe and Miss." My grandpa answered. "I'm telling you, I saw you in the kitchen." My grandma insisted. All my mother could do was laugh. She knew who was really in the kitchen. We saw Bill on a regular basis until February of 1980. The last sighting by someone other than the weirdos occurred then. Bill was seen leaving, wearing an overcoat, which was not his regular wardrobe. Grandma and Grandpa joked that he went out to dinner with them, and found another family to go home with. Bill evidently checked himself out in the mirror before he left. My mom and a family friend was sitting in the living room and saw Bill reflected in the mirror. They watched him walk down the hall and into my grandparents' bedroom. The family friend yelled, "Mom, you've got company." It was a while before any research was done to determine the origin of our resident spook. I don't know if this is the truth or not, but here goes. According to the testimony of a few neighbors and a gentleman who was on staff of the fire department, there had been a death several years prior to the sighting, sometime in the 1950s. The scoop is that a middle-aged man discovered that his wife was being unfaithful. He got ready for work as usual, kissed her goodbye, walked to the basement and through the garage. When the wife didn't hear him leave, she went downstairs to the garage and checked and make sure everything was okay. She found him swinging from the rafters. There are theories as to why he appeared when he did. Perhaps my grandfather having a severe heart attack aroused something in the spirit of the perpetually wronged husband. It could be that he waited for the right opportunity when the family would be more receptive to him. Or maybe he was waiting for sensitives to validate his haunting. I would like to say this is the end of Bill, but it's just the beginning. He's been heard playing the piano in my grandma's basement. He started a lawnmower that did not have a spark plug in it. Don't ask. I'm not a mechanic. Several people have heard him open a door that has since been sealed shut. It has a very distinct slam to it. I've had friends scared to death to stay longer than 15 minutes in my grandma's home when I lived there during my teens and early 20s because they just knew something was there, watching and waiting, wanting to be seen. And boy, has he been seen. As I mentioned previously, the haunting kind of slacked off around 1980. Not to say that we didn't all experience that familiar chill from time to time, but nothing much manifested until 1988. 1988 was a bad year. My grandfather passed away. He wasn't very old, and that added insult to injury as well. It seemed like the events coincided with his passing. I was now living with my grandma. My sister Missy had come to visit. We were in the kitchen doing dishes, listening to the radio. Normal teenage things. We heard the door between the garage and basement swing open and close. We heard the distinct sound of the footsteps on the concrete floor. The slow tread of someone walking up the stairs. Sounds pretty normal, right? Wrong. We had not heard the garage door open. Grandma was gone. No one was in the basement. My sister and I stood in the kitchen and watched as the doorknob turned. We didn't stand around to ask questions. We were out of there. That's where it began and lasted for 10 years. Things would move. A voice would be heard. I mentioned the piano playing and such. There was a lot more materializing. As my sisters and I began to have children, we would notice my niece or my son looking into the hallway and giggling. We would catch something moving out of the corner of our eyes. My niece told me about the face that she would see in the mirror of my grandfather's antique washstand. She said there was a man in there, trying to get out. Try as we might, we couldn't get better explanation than that. I woke one night to see Bill looking into my son's crib. This angered me for some reason. I sat straight up in bed and said, "Look, you've messed with me all my life. Leave my son alone." He disappeared and reappeared in the hallway. My sisters and I saw something in the hallway. As far as my family is concerned, Bill is still there. In addition to the ghosts of 2 dogs and a cat that like to chase my grandma's cat through the house, I don't think I've actually gone in somewhere and not felt that twinge, that something was there. Nearly every place I lived, with the exception of my current residence, has had something there. My husband jokes that I'm a spook magnet. What makes it worse is that I work in a hospital, and I sometimes get that twinge when heading to the cafeteria or whatever. My sisters are the same way, as are children and spouses. In fact, Two ghosts suckered us when our younger sister went to buy our house. We went on a walkthrough, looked at each other and said, "Nothing here. This is cool. Clean as a whistle." Yeah, right. Within 1 week of my sister and her family moving in, cabinets open and shut. She saw someone standing in her kitchen that didn't quite belong. She was sitting on the couch reading. The couch faces the kitchen. She had the sensation that someone was watching her. She looked up and no one was there. However, when she closed her eyes, she saw a short woman wearing a pink dress standing near her sink. She had her silver hair pulled back in a bun and did not seem very happy over being seen. My sister put down the book and said to her renter that she didn't care if she was there. She was there long before she and my brother-in-law signed the papers. As long as she behaved and did not scare anyone, nothing would happen. About that time, she heard things in the basement. She walked downstairs and sensed a little boy. That little boy is now my son's buddy. The boy is very mischievous. He likes to rewind movies, change radio stations, and likes to play darts. My middle sister watched in amazement one night as one whisked past her and hit the board. She said, "Well, if you wanted to play that bad, all you had to do was ask." As you can see, we take these things real seriously. Since my youngest sister has moved in with my younger sister, the happenings have been more pronounced. It sounds like furniture is being moved in the basement. Someone walks down the hall every night to my youngest sister's room and checks on her. I was there last night and was in the basement with my middle sister. We were sitting at my brother-in-law's computer, shopping online. The computer desk is right outside the laundry room, making it unbearably hot. I looked at my sister and said, "Geez, it's hot in here." Almost makes one wish for one of the spooks to show up and cool the place down. My sister looked at me and shook her head. "I can't believe you said that, you idiot." About 3 minutes later, the temperature dropped in the basement, dryer still on. I looked at my sister, and the hair was standing up on her arms. I had goosebumps. I started to laugh. Now that's service. What are you going to do for an encore? No sooner were those words out of my mouth than I felt something tug at the back of my hair. I looked at my sister eyes wide and said, "If I'm lying, I'm dying." But something just pulled my hair. She simply looked at me and said, "Maybe now you'll learn to be careful of what you ask for." When I was a freshman in high school, my parents moved us from the city in central New York to a big, empty house in the country. Little did we know that the house is haunted. So many things happened there that even my skeptical dad began to believe that we were sharing the house with someone or something else. My best ghost encounter occurred in the middle of the day. I walked into the bathroom and saw, from the corner of my eye, someone that I thought was my youngest sister. I said, "Hey, Lori," but she didn't answer me. Annoyed, I turned to find out what her problem was, only to realize that it wasn't her at the sink. An old woman with gray hair up in a bun, a pink flowered dress, and a white apron was drying her hands. She turned to look at me, and then she disappeared. We weren't often frightened of the ghosts and missed them when things seemed to be quiet for too long. We would lament that they didn't like us anymore. One day, I was in the house and I went into the shower. All of a sudden, there was a huge noise. I thought a plane hit the house, or at least there was a terrible car accident outside. I jumped out, grabbed my robe, and went to investigate. I found nothing out of order at all, so I got back into the shower. Not 2 minutes later, I heard that huge noise again. I jumped out, shaking this time, and checked everywhere, but again, there was nothing to find. I decided to skip my shower. I had a ghostly nightmare about this house before even moving in. My family moved into the house, and from day one, things were creepy. People before had moved out in a hurry, and their family broke apart almost instantly in 4 months. They all spread to 4 different places. When we moved in, we all got terribly sick within the first month. My mom had a life-threatening experience. My sister ran away. All the pets in the house died mysteriously with no known cause of death. My parents divorced. All of this happened in only 4 months. I walked into the house after school one day, and I heard my name being called. I knew no one was home because none of the cars were in the driveway. The voice calling my name sounded exactly like my mother, and I looked all around for her, even though I knew that she was presently in the hospital. Within the next few days, and a few more creepy paranormal events, all 4 of us left in just as much of a hurry as the one before us, leaving most of our personal belongings. We all split, each of us in a different car, to different places away from each other and away from the house. I will never go back to see it, nor would I wish the haunting of the house on anyone else. Hello. I lived at this house from 97 to 99. It was in Atlanta. My family and many of my friends were witnesses to the occurrences. Voices, electronics malfunctioning, dark figures. It happened day and night, but mostly at night. It is an older white home near the river, and for a while, we had a rat problem. The plumbers had left a hole under the bathroom sink. The rats, who were fond of shiny objects, left 2 human molars, complete with silver fillings, on the bathroom floor on 2 separate occasions. The back of the home had a foul odor, off and on, and the crawl space had been cemented over. I'm an investigator for the state, not a hysteric. But the place made a believer out of me, my family, and half a dozen friends. My then 4-year-old son complained of the man in the mirror with a string around his neck. Voices were male and female, also a small child. I've often felt the crawl space needed to be examined, just never could figure out a way to ask the officials to do such. I truly think that there is a body or bodies under that house. Myself and a girlfriend watched as a man-shaped shadow moved across the dining room wall into the kitchen where the light turned on. Well, we're checking out, if you can get the new owner's permission. So when I was about 17, my family had just moved back to Canada from living in the USA. It was a bit sudden, and being a family of 6, it was a little bit of a scramble to find a place to house all of us before the snow hit. So, my mom and dad decided to live in an old house that my grandpa had on his property, just for the duration of the approaching winter ahead. The house was my great uncle's, and my grandpa skidded from my brother's property to his place. Now my grandpa has 2 quarter sections, and this house is tucked way back away from the main house, so the powers ran from the main house, and with it being so far away, there is no running water. This house is old, so to add to the running water, there also isn't heat, only a wood stove. Just to give you an idea of where we were living in. Me, being a 17-year-old, I often stayed in town, and didn't stay there very often. I specifically remember the first time it happened. I was in my bed. I was the only one who would stay downstairs. With the wood stove, everyone wanted to sleep upstairs since it was warmer. So I was just starting to fall asleep, and I started to feel the room get really heavy. I remember the feeling of not being alone. The doorway didn't have a door on it,
It only had a beaded curtain, and I could feel it standing there. I then remember having the feeling of total fear rush over me and frozen to my core with it. Then, it moved closer, and I felt the bed move and someone crawl right beside me, not in a way that was super noticeable, but in a sneaky, slow, sloth-moving type of way. I specifically remember wanting to vomit with fear. Then, I felt it, the feeling of an unshaven face rub against mine. I scrambled out of bed, holding my blanket, and ran up the stairs to my parents' room. I was so out of my mind with fear that I couldn't even scream. I slept on the floor with my dad's side of the bed. The next morning, Mom was wondering why her 17-year-old daughter was curled up at the foot of her bed, and I told her what happened. Later that morning, we walked over to my grandpa's house to have breakfast and go chat. My mom brought up my wild story. My grandpa and grandma silently listened, as my mom was laughing at the last bit of the story. My grandparents got really serious and turned to each other. Apparently, this has been an issue in the old house, and they didn't want to tell us, hoping we didn't acknowledge it, then it wouldn't bother us. I can honestly say it didn't feel angry or upset. It just wanted to cuddle. I didn't stay there much after that. I moved in with a cousin in town,